today I've sort of prepared a short script, which is called The Institution, Stories, Characters, and Plots. Sarah just mentioned that for several years now we've been running this art space or art initiative and exhibition space in Cairo that is called Beirut. So the meta-narrative to Beirut has been a set of questions that are continuously evolving and in part informing a range of projects that you've either initiated or taken on. Beirut itself grew out of a series of serendipitous encounters with people and with the city. And it seems that over the past 3 years, to be precise, that the questions that have risen in and around rethinking the institution are not limited only to us, which is really comforting to sort of see how these questions are being picked up in different parts of the world by different institutions, curators, researchers, thinkers, and so on, artists. The emphasis on these questions, of which I would like to share a few, in many circumstances has made the institution at times a storyteller, at other times a character. And I think one really interesting way of thinking about the institution is to really think about it like a plot. Like in all the senses of meaning of the word plot. I would like to share with you some of these questions that outline how we at Beirut in Cairo think about institutions. So let us start with the basic question, right? What is an institution? And from then on we can ask, is an institution a fixed thing? Is an institution a thing at all? And if it is a thing, what are its characteristics? Is a thing an object? If it is an object, then what type of object is an institution? Perhaps the institution is a subject, or rather, we should think of the institution as a relation between subjects and objects. We can also ask, can an institution be a condition? And can this condition be summoned through practice? Then we have more polemical questions, such as, is the institution a state? Or more importantly, is the state an institution? If language is an institution, is law an institution too? And if institutions, like law, can fail us, is language failing us now? In a conversation with two artists, another question came up. Namely, if we think of the factory as an institution, how would we describe the economy that surrounds it? Is it a conglomerate of institutions? And can institutions contain other institutions like matryoshka dolls? What makes an institution an institution? In the case of Beirut, we've often pondered, can one just simply declare an institution into becoming? Is an institution fictional or real? Does it matter? Can one perform the institution in the sense of like role play? Do all institutions have a shared set of characteristics? Is an art institution different from a governmental institution? Is art in itself, with all it comprises as a field of practice, an institution? Can an institution become so large that it is no longer contained by the word institution? And really, how worthwhile is it to meditate on the word institution? Is it true that etymologically speaking, institution shares a root with the word statue? Is thinking about institutions a zeitgeist thing? Why are we questioning the institution when we have more important things to do, like live? Is living possible without institutions? Does anarchy imply a rejection of all possible institutions? If we use language, and language is an institution, does that make anarchy an impossible conundrum? Will there be institutions in the future? What is the history of institutions, really? And what are the most important milestones in humanity that mark the evolution of institutions? Is the word institution the same in every language? I don't think so. And does the translation of institution into other languages also introduce other associations than if we were all speaking English? Is an institution a narrative thing? So in the last several years, my own understanding of how one can think curatorially of an institution has changed. In other words, it has become a lot less romantic. Whereas I always imagined that one could think oneself through the paradigm of institutions and offer maybe a new proposition through a project, a series of projects, through this idea of being part of a founding of a new art space. I realize now that the task of rethinking institutions only resides in practice and cannot actually start from the sort of overarching theoretical framework, so to speak. So I'll start with the really small things. 2 days ago in Cairo, we were preparing to send back a series of artworks which were on loan from the Cadiz Art Foundation in Paris. In the absence of a more formal storage arrangement, we had opted to store the works in a darkened living room, more sort of an old-fashioned salon in an apartment that I have access to next door to the space. We received the team from a supposed art handling and shipping company. We had sort of 6 really buff, strong men and 1 really young woman. She was sort of clad with like a Marc Jacobs bag and a pink striped shirt, which sort of made up for her cohort's sort of lack of finesse, so to speak. And as we sort of started unpacking the individual works, I realized that the total sum of all our experiences, like basically all of them and then 3 of us, was still not producing the quality of a really qualified professional art handling team. So, for example, it took us precisely 58 minutes to prepare a work by Carrie Young, a print, framed, for its journey across the Mediterranean from Egypt to France. So with many works ahead, we spent roughly around 10 hours of handling, wrapping, creating a modest body of work that would really fill maybe a medium-sized exhibition. Throughout the day, sort of witnessing this, very well-intended but also sort of relatively clumsy affair, my anxiousness, obviously being responsible for those works, sort of transformed from simply a personal anxiety into sort of a full-fledged angst, if you will. It sort of grew out of the handling of these artworks in a context that clearly wasn't apt for these immaculate conditions required and often achieved, say, by the rest of a more institutionalized artwork. And my worry started taking on the sort of dimensions of a much more sort of global rumination. So here we were combating Cairo dust and negotiating artworks in a somewhat tatty apartment that was sort of really propped up to the maximum to help us out in this really strange undertaking to host a collection of original artworks as part of a collaboration with Cadis for 1 year. With that, the sort of compulsive inspection of each and every frame and the constant negotiation with the team to ensure that everybody of the 9-person strong team was wearing gloves, to the backdrop of seemingly more pressing news, right, felt more and more at odds with the problems that we were surrounded with in Cairo. We've had like 3 bombings yesterday. So an image flashed in my mind again as I was sort of writing this from Mosul in Iraq, where the Daeshis were indiscriminately like hammering away at sort of century-old sort of like Assyrian sculptures and others. You may have seen the YouTube circulating. I try to imagine the smell of the dust, like when these sculptures are being, like destroyed. And I'm trying to sort of equate it to the dust in Cairo and think if there's a similarity in that sense. And then I start thinking, is this fretting over minute details of contemporary artworks itself a very apolitical act? As the day progressed, I must this was not the case. The usefulness of this sort of epic task, let's say our collaboration with Cadis from beginning to end, has also served as an exercise in getting to know different aspects to, say, the state of things. Becoming more intimately acquainted, say, with the lack of craftsmanship, the lack of skill, and also coming to terms maybe day in, day out with this general lack of specialization that we're surrounded with in Cairo. And then asking myself, well, where does this demand to be specialized really come from? The sort of symbolic appeal of starting an international art space as Beirut, finds itself grappling with, say, finding ingenious solutions sometimes, toiling to make really the smallest of things work. If anything, I think the details of day-to-day practice become constant reminders of what we cannot take for granted. The systematized, facilitated, institutionalized are all things that are simply absent. There is no system, there is no institution, there is no state, technically. Without the details, without the parts, there is no whole. So perhaps this fretting over minute detail is not simply compulsive, but it also serves a particular purpose. An art world without artworks would not just be just a world, and a world without an art world and without art would also, I think, eliminate a necessary realm of thought and of practice. Which I also think inevitably inspires other spaces within the civic realm. And so it goes back to saying that sometimes starting with the really small and tactile things is quite essential towards thinking about the larger questions of institutions. Yesterday, on my sort of monthly journey to a bank to make a cash withdrawal for the monthly expenses that we have at the institution's salary, rent. It's all cash transactions. It's also worth noting that the bank was once national and more recently now has become acquired by a foreign bank, Italian, which doesn't really make our lives much easier, but anyway. So the system at the bank was down. The system had crashed again. And this was sort of somewhat common. Again, here I'm spending an hour and I'm musing over this idea that systems fall easily in sort of the day-to-day versus these other systems, these bigger systems that are much more resilient and that really refuse to be dismantled, politically speaking. And I'm sitting in the bank in this sort of slightly smallish, weird, artificial, claustrophobic space, and again, it's sort of a faint echo of popular chants from years before comes. So in translation, it would have been, the people demand the fall of the system, and the people demand the fall of the regime. In Arabic, it all sounds quite similar if you're hearing the people between the tellers, between each other, keep it going. The system is down, the system is down. Same idea. So I try to imagine beyond that, say, a well-intending tech development department at some bank, maybe, I don't know, at Intesa in Italy somewhere, trying to computerize every step of every transaction somewhere in Cairo. And then I think also about how incompatible, say, certain systems are when they're transferred from one place to another. Anything that is mildly sort of like computerized in a way that it has to be based on the internet here is prone to suffer. Particularly to the whim of power cuts and bouts of no electricity, right? So hearing this word system being sort of hurled back and forth at the bank, appropriated into sort of an Egyptian dialect of sorts, a system where, I keep mulling over what this word also really means, and how it relates to a glossary that informs how we think about institutions. Surely there must be a connection between institutions and systems. So, I mean, these are two recent, I guess, anecdotes or examples that I'm sort of sending you over this connection. Yeah, sort of to underscore the dynamic of everyday working life. And how that it's precisely these experiences that for us have and continue to curatorially inform our thought in and around what it means to think about institution building. And these are just two examples from this week. Earlier on, like, I was suggesting maybe that the institution could be thought of as a plot. I imagine there is something that can be thought of as subversive to the act of becoming an institution, and that generally tends to go against the grain of what many people would say. They'd be like, but that's actually the opposite of becoming an institution. There's nothing subversive about being an institution, it's actually the opposite. So I think just sort of to flesh this idea out a little bit, to say, I mean, to become an institution, right, in the legal sense, depending on where you are, is to take up some kind of stake within an existing system. I'm not as sort of hopeful as to think that one can reform, like, systems from within. However, like, the processes that we become intimately acquainted with through this practice of institutionalizing is tantamount to a form of political practice also. Because when you come to really think of it in practice, beyond the sort of desire for revolt and a change and a reform on this, how can we really suggest a shift in thinking about economic and political conditions at large when we don't fully understand the nuances and dealings that actually make up these very conditions and allow for these very conditions to flourish? So being an institution sometimes within a less than adequate system is like being an undercover researcher in that respect. Right? So it becomes also about a process where these encounters, informal encounters even at times, become opportunities for gathering information. So you can also think of the institution as an agent. It offers an opportunity of becoming more informed as a worker, as an artist, as a citizen. and sort of subsequently you're able to build a much sort of more informed sort of like claim from the system, even if you're trying to dismantle it, that is really sedimented from the ground up, and it is not just talking on the sort of broader spectrum of theoretical ideas. In the past years, I've witnessed many informal organizations making the sort of really swift decision to become institutions, to register in Egypt as companies, because it's quite hard to register as a non-governmental organization, or it allows for the government to have too much say in what you do. So you register as a company, but you act like an organization whenever possible. So naturally, becoming an institution allows for a wider range of work to be done. It allows for you to be accountable to within like financial systems. You can set up your organization in a certain way, have a bank account, have an address, all these things really matter. And with that, to offer more opportunities for people within your community. And at the same time, there's a constant negotiation like of the fields of work that we wish to bring forward versus sort of the structures that make that possible. Perhaps three or so years ago, it really felt that actually setting up an institution was a form of resistance, in a way that it was really about claiming your right to exist and creating a space for communities to come together and to practice what they want to practice, even if it's just partying or exchanging ideas or watching a film or having a discussion. And by institutionalizing even within this kind of defunct system, you're constantly working against this grain of being formally ejected by this system with all its propaganda apparatus that constantly is trying to, label us as strange to the rest of the society in a way. So you have a system that is trying to eject you, that is trying to eject difference, that is trying to homogenize, that is trying to drain us and simply to annul the work that we do and the ideas that we put forth. So to found institutions here in this context at that moment, several years ago, was really taking on a more nuanced form of activism, which is a discussion that's quite alive at the moment here, where we found at some moment that perhaps the more sort of traditional form of activism, in the strictest sense, really also resists this position of doubt. I mean, there's a condensation of so many thoughts that would be really impossible for me now to unpack with me being so far away from you. But at least just to sort of share like the outline of these ideas and give them to you perhaps for later on, to feed into your discussion with everybody else present. I will say though, over time, that even when I'm talking about this act of instituting in itself as a gesture of resistance, this today has also maybe changed again. And this is what I refer to as this thinking about the act of institutionalizing, maybe in that respect was being romanticized by us. It is definitely a relation that needs to be carefully negotiated. Because also, what does it mean to exist as an institution? Does it also not mean that you create an entity that accrues some kind of like an aura of symbolic value, and the symbolic value seems to be worth something within a particular relation of capital exchange? Doesn't it also send a message if we exist as an institution, as a space, and we're not human rights workers and we're not a journalistic entity, for example, doesn't it send a message to the world that everything is all right in Cairo, when really everything is not all right? And the transition from sort of self-organizing to becoming an institution is also able to reconfigure relations, right? Missions and expectations, even amongst really small working groups. So perhaps the question then becomes, is really thinking about being an institution the only possibility of like furthering and instating a space for one's work? Perhaps not. I think increasingly I also feel a little bit that there is an incompatibility between the discourses that think about forms of organizing and instituting and actually how we practice these very things. And sometimes I feel imagination, unfortunately, doesn't stretch as far out to include like everything that works and doesn't in that realm. There are really great examples when you look at, like, again, like the different like structures of organization within institutions, different examples of like flat hierarchy, again, like logics of like open and shared systems of work. But again, one size doesn't fit all, and institutions like stories need characters, particularly in difficult contexts. And more than characters, they need protagonists. And the latter already creates a hierarchy of visibility, of authorship and practice. So there are, again, other aspects that kind of problematize this transition also from like a much looser form of like self-organized working ethos to one that becomes an act of institutionalization and subsequently implies this institution as a story requires a protagonist, and then, again, it opens up other problems. Perhaps maybe a last thought to share would be trying to think about institutions like drawing. So if you think that, I mean, one can really only learn drawing by drawing, so you can't just simply like think it through and then come to the paper and then it will happen, but it just comes over like a long period of like doing it over and over again. Yeah, one can practice the skill of drawing and plan out a drawing, but the actual making of a drawing often exceeds also the will of the hand making it, when the medium also starts enforcing its own presence, if you want, and gradually informs also the gestures and that ultimately lead to the making of a drawing. So there's something really tactile and very visceral about drawing, and somehow I can sort of only say that it's almost similar, like in a multi-dimensional sort of way, thinking about how we make and how we think institutions into becoming. Or maybe I mentioned this example to think that it becomes maybe still a sort of an interesting and hopeful way to conclude on the note that thinking about institutions from the vantage point of art making is maybe one really interesting way of thinking about how we can nurture like an expansion of this discourse on institutions, sidestepping maybe the otherwise super well-tread area of institutional discourse. Thank you.